Thank you. So, over 30 years ago, Jim Sinclair, the founder of the first autistic-run organization, Autism Network International, articulated the set of ideas that we today know under the word neurodiversity. Now, since that time, neurodiversity has ascended the cultural heights. It's a term that's used in places like Stanford University, and to advertise the diversity hiring programs of some of our country's largest corporations. Sinclair, and I knew them well, had a broad vision for the neurodiversity movement. They were a person, in many respects, decades ahead of their time. They articulated the idea that society's approach to autistic people and to people with other neurological disabilities should be defined not by this effort to try and enforce typical appearance, but instead to empower autistic people and others to get what we needed to succeed in the world as the best version of who we are, rather than as people told and enforced, sometimes from the earliest memories of childhood, to try and pretend to be something that we are not. Now, you would think, as the neurodiversity movement has become culturally ubiquitous, we would see more progress at that kind of concrete change that Sinclair articulated. But I'm going to talk today about some of the ways in which we've fallen short of Sinclair's original vision, and some of the things that we can do to make very concrete, measurable, and specific changes in autism research and service provision to better recover the true meaning of neurodiversity. And there's no true meaning of any word, but the true meaning of neurodiversity as I first learned it, when I first got involved in neurodiversity advocacy as a young teenager, learning from people like Jim Sinclair and the other early leaders of the neurodiversity movement. Because, and I'll move off Jim in a moment, but I want to share one more thing about him that I think is relevant to this conversation. It's a sad fact of history that as neurodiversity became increasingly, as a term, welcomed in great agglomerations of wealth and power, Jim Sinclair continued to live on SSI and lived in poverty. And the reason for that, it's not just a personal tragedy. The reason I bring this up is not just the sort of fundamental unfairness of that. The reason I bring this up is a big part of the reason why Sinclair's ideas ascended, but Sinclair as a person did not, was because the true scope of their vision for neurodiversity was far broader than the neurodiversity movement that we today see in many circles. Sinclair didn't just want to change the rhetoric we use surrounding autism. They wanted to change the service provision system. They wanted to change the experiences that autistic people who are, in many respects, the most vulnerable, those who are in the special education system, those who are receiving developmental disability services, those who are caught up in the world of publicly funded service provision, which is today, as in many respects, as abusive and toxic as ever in the context of autism. They didn't just want another disability euphemism, to say neurodivergent instead of neurological disability. They had a vision for very concrete and specific change. I'm going to talk about some frameworks we can use to begin to change autism research and service provision to better align ourselves with that broader vision. So many of the ideas I'm going to be talking about today, come from a recently published article that I and some of my colleagues, Kenneth Richman, Alison McCarthy, and Daniel Wilkenfeld, published about a year and a half ago in Ethics and Human Research. It's called A Passing Problem. A little bit of a pun, because the focus of the article is how autism research, and much of this really just generalizes to clinical practice as well. So I think you can apply it to service provision just as much as you can apply it to the worlds of research, has a problem in that much of the ways in which autism interventions are delivered prioritize the goal of passing, of trying to make autistic people pass as non-autistic. What do I mean by passing? So Irving Goffman, one of the great fathers of sociology, said that passing is the management of undisclosed, discredited information about oneself. Essentially, a Black person pretending to be white, a gay person pretending to be straight, a Jewish person pretending to be a Gentile, a person with a mental illness pretending to be non-disabled, person with any disability pretending to be non-disabled. And it's pretty well established, whether we're talking about the disability or the non-disability context, that passing has some pretty harmful impacts on people. That living your life pretending to be something that you are not is something with some pretty serious mental health consequences. We have some evidence of this specific to autism as well. There's a literature, and sometimes it uses the word camouflaging, sometimes it uses the word masking, sometimes it uses the word passing, but there's a literature that really shows a host of mental health problems, from burnout to suicidality, many others that are associated with this kind of passing in the broader society. So it imposes cognitive demands. Even if you're very good at it, you're spending energy and cognitive resources on trying to pass that you do not have available for other things. Passing demands also internalize stigma. They essentially say that the problems that autistic people face are really emerging solely out of the fact that they are autistic and their autistic traits. And so it doesn't really, unlike some of the more sophisticated conceptions like Damian Milton's double empathy problem framing, it doesn't really acknowledge that communication is a reciprocal activity, and there is some responsibility for adaptation in order to enable effective communication on the part of both autistic and non-autistic people. Another problem that we see emerge out of passing is, just to speak very bluntly, we're not very good at teaching people how to do it. For those of you who have spent any appreciable amount of time with people in special education services or developmental disability services, you're probably familiar with this interesting and rather unfortunate uncanny valley effect that exists on the part of people who have gone through intensive social skills training, where social skills, which are by their very nature contextual and adaptive, are taught as a set of hard and fast rules. And so you see people receive instructions like, you should always make eye contact with people. Always. And you should smile when people are talking to you, and you should always smile. And more concerningly, people really have internalized within them a fear of telling people no, a fear of asserting any kind of boundary, which of course, when we think about it for a moment, is the natural result of teaching people from a very early age that the way they move, the way they interact, the way they communicate are irredeemably wrong. And this makes people tremendously vulnerable. And it really does place people in this very difficult position throughout life when they are taught to ignore any desire on their part to assert a boundary or say no. So we don't do a very good job teaching passing, and in fact, what we're actually teaching are things that are very maladaptive and harmful. And then finally, particularly when we take into account the tremendous amount of time that passing-oriented interventions take up in the lives of autistic children and adults, passing demands impose an opportunity cost. I think it was Connie Kasari of UCLA who said that 40 hours a week of ABA is essentially a full-time job for a 3-year-old. And that has real consequences. Okay, you are crowding out, first and foremost, many of the really crucial experiences of childhood, the opportunity to form meaningful relationships with one's family, the opportunity for unstructured play, the opportunity to interact with other children in a way that may actually be far more effective at developing some of the skills people will need over the course of their life. You're also crowding out the opportunity for more meaningful interventions because it's no secret, I'm a great critic of ABA, but I think even the proponents of ABA would probably, perhaps not the most extreme ones, but even the proponents would probably acknowledge it doesn't really have a theory for the development of language. It doesn't really have a framework for developing many of the things oriented around communication that are so crucial for autistic people. And it's been a long-standing problem, long-standing open secret in many circles, that as school districts, as service provision infrastructure have placed more and more of an emphasis on behavioral intervention for autistic children, it's been harder and harder for speech-language pathologists and occupational therapists and other modalities of service provision that I would say are far more aligned with our values and principles to get in the classroom. People have this idea promoted by aggressive industry advocacy over many decades that autism equals ABA. And I think that's quite harmful for any number of different reasons. So we have any number of different reasons to believe that passing demands harm autistic people. We also can hear the voices of autistic people themselves on this. And I will say, I do think we have to sometimes be cautious about prioritizing lived experience over everything else, right? I'm a big believer that you take lived experience and you take research and you take expertise and you synthesize them together, and you don't just say, oh, I have one, so I don't need the other. But I think to understand the stakes, it's important to hear people's voices. This is a quote from a project called the Autistic Passing Project. It's run by an autistic woman named Amanda Vivian, good friend of mine actually, who collected perspectives of autistic people on the experience of passing. This quote reads, "I'm actually at a point now where I rarely leave the house because I don't have the energy to pass. Passing imposes cognitive demands. It made me angry and sad and frustrated because I never stopped being autistic. I just learned how to get around in an NT world better. But these days, I am pretending to be normal for them, not myself. And that's what hurts." And there are many, many other quotes like this. I won't read them all to you, but I think they're very powerful because they illustrate really the same thing that the research literature is illustrating. That this effort embedded into our service provision and intervention cultures is not without cost. It's not just that we don't do this well. It's that it is a goal that is not worth pursuing, at least not without realizing and engaging meaningfully with the potential harms that it causes. So I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of how we might operationalize neurodiversity. What does this mean? Okay, because it's a frankly. It's a long-standing problem at convenings like this that people like me rile you all up and convince you of the justness of the cause, but don't give you something specific we should be changing in the way we do our work. And when we don't give you the specifics, other people do. And those specifics may be more aligned with a very different vision than the ideas of the neurodiversity movement as articulated by Jim Sinclair and as articulated by a great many other autistic people since then. I think, and this is really a heavy focus of that article I just mentioned that we published in Ethics in Human Research, I think a very big part of where the rubber meets the road in autism research and service provision is how we measure outcomes. So the question of what works in autism has haunted the field since well before the idea of neurodiversity came on the scene. And anytime, I'm trained as a health services researcher, so this is something that's very much on my mind, as an academic, as much as, given my prior history as an advocate. So anytime you want to answer the question, what works, or does something work, you have to answer the question, at what? And how do you measure it? And the measures, the outcome measures that we very frequently make use of in clinical trials, and in service provision with respect to autism have passing demands embedded within them in ways that essentially incentivize intervention developers and service providers to prioritize passing over more meaningful goals. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at some commonly used measures in the context of autism. So here at the top, we have the Pervasive Developmental Disorder Behavior Inventory. And among the items within the Pervasive Developmental Disorder Behavior Inventory is whether or not someone flaps their hands up and down, whether or not someone makes odd or unusual finger movements, whether or not someone puts an unusual stress on words when speaking, whether or not someone spins objects in a repetitive manner. All of these things are diagnostic of autism. Yes, all of these things are things autistic people are more likely to do. So if you are developing a diagnostic measure, a measure designed to determine, is this child or is this adult autistic, perfectly appropriate. But these measures, they're not diagnostic measures, they're outcome measures. So the presence of these items within these measures, and I can go into other examples, and I will, essentially means that an intervention is judged as more successful if it reduces the frequency with which an autistic person flaps their hands up and down, if it reduces the frequency with which an autistic person spins objects in a repetitive manner, and is judged as less successful if it does not do these things. This is the yardstick upon which our service provision system is being designed to align to. This is what we're building on. And you have to ask yourself, by what right? How does this benefit someone? Autistic children and adults have many challenges, many very real challenges. And one of the things that I believed and continue to believe throughout my entire life is that the ideas of neurodiversity, properly defined, have relevance across the broad spectrum of impairments that exists in autism. And there is some quite severe impairment that many autistic people have. But even if you cannot speak, if you struggle with self-injurious behavior, in fact, I would argue especially if you cannot speak and you struggle with self-injurious behavior, is this really what we want our service providers and early intervention professionals to be focusing on? Is this benefiting people? And of course it goes on. The social reciprocity scale, which is actually the most commonly used outcome measure in clinical trials in autism, includes many similar items. Here, I'll give you as an example a few items from the social reciprocity scale. You can see, again, right off the bat, avoids eye contact or has unusual eye contact. If someone is scored as having a greater degree of unusual eye contact, more frequent unusual eye contact after receiving an intervention, and there has not been a change from before receiving an intervention, particularly in a well-designed study relative to a randomized control group, then that intervention is considered to be less effective. Now, this isn't the case for every item that's present within these measures. There are others that I think are quite appropriate. Has difficulty making friends, even when trying his or her best. That's a totally appropriate target for intervention, making it easier for people to form friendships. Now, of course, it may be the case, very frequently is the case, that many autistic people will develop that skill in different ways than non-autistic people. But the ability to form friendships is something that we absolutely should support as a legitimate goal of service provision. So this isn't the case with every single item within these outcome measures. One of the things that I like about digging into these measures is that it gives us the opportunity to be granular and trait specific in thinking about how to apply the idea of neurodiversity. The autism world has these horribly interminable culture wars that I've observed throughout my adult life. The truth is we do disagree on a lot of things that are quite morally consequential. But also sometimes, not always, but sometimes, there is a problem of communication. Because I think there are a lot of people who are, in my opinion, very inaccurately spreading the idea that neurodiversity advocacy means not helping people to communicate who can't talk, or not helping people who struggle with self-injurious behavior or struggle with independent living skills. That's not true at all. I've worked to try and advance those goals of communication, of independent living, of addressing the many challenges that autistic people with severe impairment have over the course of my career. I know many other people in the neurodiversity movement who do so as well. Certainly, no movement is perfect, and there are some people I would level that critique to, but I don't think it characterizes the ideas of the movement as a whole. But by getting into the specifics of these items, by really digging into what we're actually measuring in autism research and service provision, we have the opportunity, I think, potentially, to turn down the temperature in autism's culture wars and to actually be far more effective at shifting service provision. Not to create a situation where your local ABA provider says neurodivergent instead of whatever they were using before, but instead to actually shift the kinds of services that autistic children are referred to when they enter into early intervention. Not to just make whatever special, separate, gated community neo-institution call themselves neurodiversity affirming, but to actually shift the ways in which we support people with all kinds of disabilities to receive truly integrated services in the broader community, and to have those services not come with the assumption that it is the role, the province of the service provider to try and dictate the appearance and mannerisms of the person they are supporting. So I think this is just a great opportunity for us to get down to brass tacks in a way that may move the conversation forward. And you see many other examples, again, more from the social reciprocity scale. I have repetitive behavior, this is from the adult version. I have repetitive behaviors that others consider odd. You have repetitive behaviors that others consider odd. the social reciprocity scale embeds the expectation that an intervention should reduce their frequency in order to be considered more effective. I tend to talk in a monotone voice. Again, embedded within this measure is the expectation that it is the goal of service provision to give people more typical vocal prosody. One thing that I think is kind of fascinating is you can see this, the degree to which ideas that might even have been appropriate in some contexts have been imported whole cloth into autism without assessing whether or not they actually make sense. This is an excerpt from the Cybox ASD. It's an adaptation of something called the Children's Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, the Cybox, which is a commonly used outcome measure in obsessive compulsive disorder. And some researchers basically got the idea that, well, people with OCD have repetitive behaviors, and autistic people have repetitive behaviors. And wouldn't it be great if we had a measure for the frequency of repetitive behaviors that we could use as an outcome measure in clinical trials and intervention studies to assess the efficacy of an intervention that was normed to autism, that used examples of repetitive behaviors that are common to autistic people rather than common to people with OCD. Problem is that they really only changed the examples. They didn't evaluate the underlying normative framework behind this measure and assess if what was appropriate as a normative framework, as a set of goals in the context of OCD, also made sense in the context of autism. Because of course, people with OCD generally experience repetitive behaviors in a very different way than autistic people experience repetitive behaviors. There's a very different dynamic that people have when something is a source of distress as compared to when something is a source of pleasure or self-regulation or helps them manage anxiety or any number of other things that autistic people turn to stimming for. And so what you see here is, again, a whole host of items that I really do not think, I would hope that most of the people in this room, whatever the level of impairment that we're talking about do not think are appropriate areas of intervention. Is it appropriate for a service provider to define themselves as having the goal of reducing the frequency of someone ordering and arranging objects? Is it appropriate for a service provider to orient themselves to having the goal of reducing the frequency with which someone rereads the same book or watches the same video? Now, there are things here that are appropriate as intervention targets. Repetitive sexual behavior, repetitive self-injurious behavior. Yeah, there's a version of that in which there's an appropriate intervention target. We could argue about the ways in which you're going to approach intervening there. But here we're finally moving into a dynamic where we're really distinguishing between arguments about means and arguments around ends. We see this elsewhere within the Cybox ASD. Again, really adapting something that made a lot of sense in the context of OCD, didn't really make sense in the context of autism. The intervention scores an item as more severe if someone would react with distress if prevented from performing a repetitive behavior. That might make sense in OCD. Doesn't really make sense to say that the goal of an intervention should be to make someone react with less distress when someone comes in and tries to stop them from hand flapping. I think people have every reason to be distressed when people try and do that. Similarly, an item is scored as more severe if someone does not try and resist against repetitive behavior, really embedding the idea that intervention should be promoting this internal effort to pass, very directly within the intervention. We're very directly within the measure. So there's a lot here that I think we have reason to be very concerned by. So I'm going to speak to a couple of other items here. You might ask, okay, Ari, yeah, passing demands are bad, but people experience them all the time. And it's very common for someone to be preparing for a job interview, for an autistic person or a person with another neurological disability to be preparing for a job interview and say, okay, I'm not going to be my authentic self at this job interview. I'm going to get the job, and then maybe I'll ask for accommodations. There are all kinds of contexts in which people make compromises with the injustice of passing demands. So, okay, if that's okay, why isn't it all right to embed them within our outcome measures? Why are clinical passing demands more dangerous than non-clinical ones? Not to say the non-clinical ones aren't dangerous, but why do we have special concern around clinical passing demands? Well, the first thing I would say here is that when someone is receiving an intervention, there is an inherent power imbalance. And that's especially the case when we're talking about interventions that are delivered on young children, which is very frequently the case when we're talking about autism services. Autistic people who are receiving interventions have very little ability to say no. Okay? Someone preparing for a job interview or deciding how they're going to socialize when meeting, how they're going to present themselves when meeting a new friend for the first time, they have a lot of ability to say no, to remove themselves from that situation. The clinical context very frequently limits that autonomy. Second, clinical passing demands are likely much more immediate and totalizing. When you embed something as a goal in an outcome measure, you are not saying, well, sometimes this might be an appropriate thing to pursue under some circumstances if the person wants it. You're saying, this is something that we should be prioritizing across the board in how we structure interventions. And then, in specific to the research context, there are a lot of very particular concerns with the ways in which autism research is conducted, some of which are specific to autism research. There's a real problem with substituted decision-making and even assent, where it's possible, being waived in autism research. It comes up particularly in behavioral interventions. We really don't do a good enough job tracking adverse events in autism research interventions. So there are, I think, reasons to be particularly concerned about clinical passing demands. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to jump through a little bit here. So a couple of takeaways. First, we need to separate diagnosis and outcome measurement. Again, many of the things I showed you in the PDD-BI, the SRS-2, the other measures, perfectly appropriate for diagnosing autism, totally inappropriate for measuring how successful an intervention is in changing outcomes. Two, we should have a really strong presumption against the use of passing demands. But this leaves us with an important question. Namely, are there any circumstances under which that presumption might be overcome? And this, I think, is also really relevant to the discussion around taking what I would refer to as a trait-specific approach to neurodiversity. A lot of people have been arguing about, should we be creating populations in which neurodiversity applies and other populations in which only the medical model applies? I don't believe in that. I think these ideas have just as much relevance to people with severe impairment, people with more mild impairment. But I do think we can take a trait-specific approach and really evaluate each intervention goal for its ethical appropriateness without saying, this population, these ideas apply to, and this population, these ideas don't. But to really create an ethical framework in which we can evaluate the appropriateness of goals within the same person, the appropriateness of particular traits within the same person to be a target of intervention, and reach different conclusions, again, within that same person. In our article, we propose a two-part test. We say, first, does an intervention serve a non-passing purpose? Are we simply pursuing this intervention goal because it makes someone look less autistic? Or is there some other goal that we are trying to pursue here? And we don't want to be too cute by half. You can't simply say, Well, we want people to communicate better and have more friends, and people who make eye contact are more likely to have people who make friends with them. You can't smuggle in the passing demand into the non-passing goal. But there are plenty of instances in which passing may emerge as an incidental effect of teaching someone greater independent living or greater communication. Someone who can make themselves understood to others might, from some people's perspectives, seem less autistic. I think people who know a lot of autistic people wouldn't take that perspective. But I don't think we would say that the only reason you would try and empower people to communicate is to make them look less autistic. Communication is a worthwhile goal in and of itself. And then the second thing we ask is this the least burdensome means of accomplishing that purpose? And here we're really taking something that's really being adapted from disability law, where we frequently talk about things like the most integrated setting, i.e. Olmsted, or the least restrictive environment, i.e. IDEA. And this is something that is going to be highly individualized. It's going to be different for different people. But again, this really reinforces the inappropriateness of trying to incorporate these kinds of passing demands in standardized outcome measures across the board. So there's a whole host of different things that we need to change when it comes to how we approach autism service provision. I'm very fond of this quote from Kenji Yoshino, a very prominent law professor, who's written about passing and corollary covering, which I don't have time to talk about now, in different contexts, but I think it captures the ideas we're trying to get across here. Civil rights practice is fundamentally about who has to change. We should really be cautious, and we really need to make a lot of changes in the ways in which we have embedded within the ways we approach autism research and service provision, the expectation that autistic people have to change. If we can make these shifts, if we can turn ourselves from these interminable arguments on social media into the concrete and specific work that has to be done to try and change the ways in which our service provision is harming autistic people who are under its power, we can build a better world. I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all today, and I thank you for the work that you will be doing to build that world together. Thank you.